And we will begin our city council work session. We have one item on the agenda tonight, and that is our community dialogue on the 2025 budget.
Yes, good evening. Well, wait, I think Josepha was going to join us virtually. Is she here? Okay.
I'm here.
Good evening. Do we have anybody else online, Justin?
Yeah.
Ken. Okay, well. As we have talked about from the outset of the budget process, the communication and ability to get the public very engaged in the budget process is always a challenge, but we appreciate Juliana being here. I also knew that I spoke with Alyssa Jackson from Channel 41 News. I think I had mentioned, at least to the mayor, if not others, that they have switched to kind of a beat format. And she and I met a month or so ago and just trying to stay regularly plugged in. So there'll probably be a story. She had a 3 p.m. deadline this afternoon, or she may, I don't think she'll sneak in, but anyway, so we are nearing the final stages of budget preparation. So I put a copy of the presentation that's in the packet. I put it at your place to just kind of follow along. Most of this you have heard throughout various meetings going all the way back to March, but it's always nice to sort of summarize it, have it all in one place. And then we will kind of move towards the finish line, which will be the public hearing scheduled for our August 21st meeting. So in the community dialogue, next slide, please. We just tried to make sure that we introduce, for the public's benefit, who you all are. They can put names and faces together. Next slide, please. And we also share typically just our organizational structure and chart. Next slide, please. And then, so we've talked about why is it that we budget. It's important for us to identify the priorities, our goals, our objectives for the services and programs that we're delivering to the community. It's also really key in identifying the revenue mix that is necessary to support that service delivery and our infrastructure investment. The budget is a public-facing document. It allows us to kind of communicate where our dollars are going. It helps us plan and project future needs and challenges, and it is required by state statute. We've talked about this before, sort of where do our priorities, goals, and objectives come from? And they come into the annual budget process from a variety of sources, from citizens, council, staff, our board and commissions. The Direction Finder survey has been an important tool periodically, and we are set to have an update to that process in 2025. The council has held goal setting retreats, your constituent contacts throughout the year, regional priorities and programs that we're connected with, best practices, professional networking, meetings and retreat, or kind of all of those things that feed into the process and help us prioritize and allocate limited resources. So what does an annual budget really pay for? Basic operations. All of our operating departments, police, public works, parks and recreation, administration, the community priorities, whether that be in recent years, the focus has been on street maintenance and improvements to our outdoor park system. Recommended reserves, making sure that we are reserving funds appropriately to have the flexibility to react and respond to unexpected challenges that we might face in any given year related to revenues or expenses. And then infrastructure maintenance. Next slide, please. As stewards of the public resources, we have to continually sort of seek what's the appropriate balance between revenue and expenses. So we have that we can look at reducing expenses. We can look at delaying purchases or projects. We can privatize or outsource services. We can discontinue services and programs. We can also look at grants and other people's money, which I know Councilmember Kring and others are very fond of. We can look at increases to fees and charges. We try to make sure we don't get too far behind or ahead of others in our region. And we can look at increasing taxes, which is always a challenge for the governing body. So it's really all just a matter of time and money. But as we consider all of those things, we want to, again, balance quality of life issues for our residents, the impacts that we have on service delivery, things that are mandated to us by federal, state, or other local county government, unanticipated events, pandemic, storms, a variety of different things. And we also really want to look at the long-term sustainability and viability of the programs and services that we're able to deliver. So then transitioning into kind of looking at the overview of our 2025 general fund. As we've mentioned, our general fund is the largest of the city's 19 plus individual funds that fall under the umbrella of the city budget. It covers all of our operating departments and services and some limited capital expenses that support those department operations. It is where we reserve where reserve funds are maintained, and we build it very conservatively because we are still 6 months out. Not quite, little closer now, but typically we have to do revenue projections and expense projections beginning in the first quarter of the year before the fiscal year starts. And we continue to monitor that through both final budget adoption, excuse me, and throughout the course of each fiscal year. And the general fund typically has that 1 year focus for both revenues and expenses. So as we look at estimated general fund revenues for 2025, we are somewhat evenly balanced. Property taxes account for about 25% of the general fund revenues, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me start with a higher level. So estimated in the 2025 budget, we're estimating about $16.25 million in revenues. That's a 7% increase over our 2024 estimated. And as we've talked about in previous budget work sessions, about 88% of those revenues come from 5 primary sources: property taxes, sales taxes, franchise fees, parks and recreation revenues, and fines and forfeitures. Property tax is about 25%. Sales and use tax in this graph is represented at 28%. But the intergovernmental revenue category is where we capture the pass-through of county sales and use tax. So actually, our sales tax is closer to about 33% of the overall total. Sales and use tax performance remains fairly consistent, and we're showing just some modest growth for 2025. We are continuing to see very positive recovery of community center revenues. And the budget at this point has been built on maintaining the mill levy at the current rate of 18.497 mills. When we look at property tax revenues, which is really oftentimes where the focus from the constituent community comes as we talk about our budget, it's really important to take a long-term view. The average growth that we've experienced in mission in assessed valuation, so not revenues, but assessed valuation over the last 5 years is about 7%. And during that time, we experienced a high of about 11%, and that was in 2023, and a low of 4%, which is this year in 2025. The 2020, sorry, then that's a typo, 2024, it should be 2025 tax year growth is 4%. And 1 mill is anticipated to generate about $223,000 in the 2025 budget. So in the first table on this slide, you can kind of see going all the way back to 2016, our assessed valuation and the mill levy and the percent change year to year. And then the table below indicates what we actual collections for 23, estimates for 24 on our proposed budget for 2025. And so you can kind of, one of the questions I had this week was related to the revenue neutral rate and what would we do with all of that increase in money? And it's less than $200,000 if we were to hold, if we were to roll back to the revenue neutral rate for 2025 budget, which is 17.719 mils versus maintaining at 8.497. And so if you think about the conversations that we've had around our budget increases, competition in the labor market, benefit increases in the cost of goods and services, that it's not a huge windfall that we have by being able to maintain that same mill levy. We're also recovering, as we talked about last year, and I think if you go to the next slide, please. So current mill rate 18.497, and you can kind of see we were at about 18 mills several years ago. And because of a variety of different factors, some changes in some forms, some of the TIF accounting, we actually had slipped and we lost some mills, even though the council was intending to keep the mill levy constant. So last year, and go to the next slide, please. Last year, we had a lot of conversation around a mill levy increase, and the council did ultimately elect to increase the mill just by a little over 2 mills. And this slide has some data from last year, but I think what it illustrated was really one of the ways that we looked at evaluating what an appropriate increase in our mill levy might be was a question that we have asked historically on the Direction Finder survey, and aligning those things that residents identify as their priorities and what level of support or increased financial support they might be willing to invest. So you can see here that you had, over 60% of the folks in the statistically valid Direction Finder survey that said they would be willing to invest more than $6 or more in those priorities. And last year's increase of 2 mills was on average for the average homeowner about that $6. So we kept that kind of in that range. Yes.
Just
Debbie.
as a frame of reference, in the year 2000, the mill levy in Mission, Kansas was 5.116. It was the lowest in the state of Kansas, and people really liked that as taxpayers, but nothing was being fixed. There were
Yeah.
no monies put aside for street repair, for parks, for any of that. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think one of the things that I hope for some of you, this is your first time through a budget with us, others not, but I think what you will find is that we are very careful and thoughtful in anything that we recommend. And, for example, we've had several conversations in our last few budget meetings about how we are having to hold. We're not able to fund many of the supplemental requests or even the basic equipment requests in this year's budget because of revenues. We're not proposing a mill levy increase to be able to address that. We want to be able to, the council again had the foresight and the political will to do that last year. And we want to be able to sort of really tie those to the needs that we have, and having a plan for how to not leave us in an unfortunate situation or where we're really playing catch up for deferred maintenance in particular. If you look at then sales tax revenues, which is in fact the largest revenue generator for the budget overall. So many of those sales tax revenues go into, and the ones reflected here are general fund sales tax revenues. We also have sales tax revenues in our dedicated street fund and parks and recreation fund. As I've mentioned, the sales and use tax performance remains fairly consistent. We're estimating a little bit of growth. One of the things that we've had success with in sales taxes is that sales tax is not just paid by Mission residents. It's paid by anybody who comes into our community to shop. And we have been very fortunate when we look at something called a pull factor, which is what is your pull for retail sales into your community. We're about 60%, a little over 60%, based on a study by the Kansas Department of Revenue for 2023, says that 60% of that revenue is coming from outside of our community, which helps balance kind of the burden that falls on Mission residents. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is Parks and Recreation revenues. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, we are improving. The facility, the community center will celebrate its 25th anniversary this year, which is in many ways hard to believe. Coming off of a feasibility study that the final report was presented in 2023, the goal is to return to somewhere between a 70 and 80% cost recovery overall for the facility. The feasibility study suggested that recovery is possible in 2 to 3 years. And I didn't look, if you look at the interim financials for June, I think you're trending in this upper 60% at this point. So we're making progress faster than we had anticipated. And then we have brought our business manager on board in July, who we will meet later this evening to really assist and support that data collection and analysis and help us make decisions for the long term. Franchise fees, fines and forfeitures remain pretty steady. That's generally 5% of gross receipts from the various utilities, can be impacted by weather and rate increases by the various utility providers. Then we have fines and forfeitures, which are those fines that result from traffic, primarily traffic violations, but also code or other municipal ordinance violations. Those are significantly impacted by staffing levels, also the adjudication in municipal court. And we have seen a pretty significant and important recovery in fines and forfeiture revenues. When it comes to any questions, I'll stop there about general fund expenses, revenues, then we'll go to expenses. Okay, general fund expenses. So every year we look at several options and alternatives to bring the balance into budget. We look at eliminating or combining positions. We look at holding positions open intentionally. We look at the delay in the purchase of capital equipment. We can eliminate or reduce budget line items. We can privatize or outsource services. And each line, even though we do not do zero-based budgeting, each line item in each department budget is reviewed annually. We budget expenses in the general fund in 4 categories: personnel, contractual, commodities, and capital. We also incorporate transfers to other funds that are counted as expenses. The transfers included in the 2025 budget are $1.38 million to the CIP fund for street maintenance. That's a slight reduction. You may recall we talked about the supplemental request for asset management software and bringing half in from the stormwater utility fund and then reducing the transfer to CIP for street maintenance by the other half of that asset inventory software. And then about $55,000 to the solid waste utility to fund and subsidize a portion of the citywide trash contract, which now also includes the recycling containers for our downtown businesses. General expenses by function. Public Works on this slide, which includes our Public Works Department and our Community Development Department, I believe, if I did the math correctly. It accounts for the largest portion of expenses, followed by Parks and Recreation, Public Safety, and then administration, which is general overhead, legislative, and administration. So that we're pretty equally balanced across that. Overall, it's a 4% increase in estimated expenditures over 2024. And right now we're estimating about $14.42 million in expenses. Personnel expenses for 2025 in the general fund total about $9.6 million. We continue to see really tight competition from both public and private sector entities that keep us on our toes when it comes to recruiting and retaining employees. Personnel costs are estimated to be 59% of the general fund budget in 2025. Your target is somewhere between 60 and 65%. So we always want to try to make sure that we're not getting too extended when it comes to personnel expenses. We have no changes to personnel included in the 2025 budget. Total of 73 full-time employees, 5 part-time, and that's actually we reduced the number of full-time employees in the 2024 budget. So we saw that reduction, sort of a consolidation of a court clerk and a police records clerk's position. Yes.
Did we lapse any FTE hours?
We do. We don't formally build that in as part of our budget calculations. We budget each year as if each department were fully staffed. When we go through this annual budget process and we look at the revised budget for the year, we're going back and doing a year-to-date payroll estimate, and we're trying to tighten those numbers up and take advantage of any savings we have realized there. But we don't have a formal sort of formula or mechanism that we put in. Okay, so general fund expense comparison between 2024 to 2025. This breaks it down into those categories: personnel, contractual, commodities, capital, debt service. Here, the debt service carried by the general fund relates to the FCIP improvements that were made several years ago. Personnel costs experience about an 8% increase. And again, that's assuming we are fully staffed. We know we will not be for the whole year, but we also will not have projections, or we will not have our health insurance numbers for next year until mid-October. So again, we try to be conservative there because we've been very fortunate in the last several years to have several years of 0% increases. We had 1 year of 22%. So we try to budget about middle of the road. And so some of that personnel savings helps us in that category. Contractuals are maintained at essentially the same level. So that's service contracts, preventative maintenance contracts, mowing, anything that we do with consultants sort of falls into that category. Commodities are increasing by about 8%, driven by fuel cost and the cost of goods and services. Just like everybody else in their personal lives, whenever we go to buy something, it's more expensive than it was last year. Debt service I touched on was the FCIP issue, and then transfers increase for 2025 with funds going to the Equipment Reserve and Replacement Fund, in addition to the CIP fund for streets and the solid waste fund. Supplemental requests, we've talked a lot about those. Last week, we sort of hit on the supplementals, which are included. Many of those are what I would consider sort of life safety issues, whether that's radios in our Public Works Department or fire panel replacement in this building and some other things. We know we have a lot of work to do to try to bring those other supplemental funds. And I do appreciate each year the kind of cooperation and collaboration among the department directors and their willingness to sort of collectively understand what direction we're all heading and offer up delays in their own priority items. So we are very fortunate in that regard. General fund reserves, next slide, please. GFOA recommends no less than 2 months of operating reserves. City Council formal policy is 25% of our annual general fund revenues, which is right about in that same 2 to 3 month range. And general fund reserves are designed to mitigate revenue shortfalls, unanticipated expenditures, and to help us kind of ensure stable tax rates. It can be used to balance the budget or to help fund unanticipated or unique expenses. So each year, the balancing act is sort of how much is too much? How much do we need to make sure we have an appropriate rainy day fund? And how far can we stretch those dollars to accomplish our goals and objectives? One of the things that it was always interesting to me to illustrate was that any increase that we have in general fund revenues also increases the amount of money that we have to reserve. And so if a revenue increase of $500,000, we can really only spend $375,000 of that because we're reserving 25%. So you kind of have to, once you kind of get into that cycle of like every time we raise that, 25% should come right off the top and go into that reserve fund. And then one-time revenues, we talked about this year, things like ARPA funds or the funds that we had for the automated license plate readers, one-time revenues that are for specific expenses, often that are occurring in that same year, are really excluded from fund balance considerations. We don't need to reserve on things that are in and out in that exact same year. Leveraging outside resources, and I will update this chart even more, but one of the most effective things that we can do is to stretch dollars is to leverage outside resources or use other people's money. So the outside resources that we had secured between 2020 and 2023 totaled $11.1 million, which is pretty significant. A big piece of that is the $6 million in surface transportation funds that have been allocated for the Lamar project. In 2026, I will update this slide because we do anticipate, and I think are closer to having a significant, about $4 million in SMAC funds committed for the Rock Creek Channel project, which will add to this. And, but staff hears, understands, and is committed to the council's goals as well of trying to turn over every rock that we can for money. In addition to the general fund budget, each year we look at a 5-year capital improvement program that covers things: streets, stormwater, parks, buildings, public facilities, technology, vehicles, and equipments. Kind of causes us pause and to say, where are we today? What are the threats or opportunities that we have in each category? And we just have sort of this ongoing constant rebalancing and reevaluation of priorities. As we have talked about, streets and stormwater and parks in recent years have had very significant focus. We've made tremendous strides, either catching up with deferred maintenance or making improvements or have improvements planned for our outdoor parks. Public buildings and facilities, particularly City Hall and the police station, are going to be looming in the very near future in terms of needing to make some significant decisions there. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the only debt that we carry in the general fund is for the facility conservation improvements. The rest of the debt is carried in the various capital improvement funds. This is just a snapshot of our debt summary from 2025. So you can see we're carrying that debt for street projects, outdoor park improvements, and stormwater improvements. So at the end of 2025, we have an outstanding balance of about $11.3 million in debt related to the CIP. Typically, we do a debt issue with a 10-year payoff. We have stretched some of our stormwater issues out slightly longer just because of the useful life of the asset being funded. But overall, our debt retirement strategy and philosophy has been very aggressive. Next slide, please. Okay, so CIP program areas for 2025. In the stormwater category, local revenues, which are the stormwater utility fee that is charged on each parcel, special assessment revenues and drainage district revenues total about $2.67 million estimated for 2025, and that's without the $600,000 a year gateway assessment. So we've not built any of the 5-year budget assuming receipt of that. Other revenues anticipated in 2025 for stormwater, about $500,000 in county SMAC funding. On the street side, revenues that feed into the street program include gas tax that we have as a distribution from the state, our 3/8 cent dedicated street sales tax. And then the city council has, since 2015, dedicated a significant amount of property tax revenue collected in the general fund to the capital improvement fund for street maintenance. And I believe in 2025, that number is just shy of 40%. So many other cities who have that. So to Councilmember Kring's point, we've historically had a very low mill levy, and even when we've increased it, taken a significant portion of that and again committed it to deferred maintenance and infrastructure. And then Parks and Recreation, we have the 3/8 cent sales tax, and then we have 1/3 of the alcohol tax distribution, totaling about $1.34 million. So expenditure highlights in those 3 CIP program areas for 2025. In stormwater, we're looking at design of the Rock Creek Channel improvements from Outlook to Woodson. Design on that project is estimated at about $1 million. 5424 Maple Channel repair work on a comprehensive stormwater master plan, about $450,000 in localized drainage or maintenance projects, and then debt service. Streets, we have our annual residential street maintenance program, which we try to fund about $2 million annually. The CARS project for 2025 is going to be 63rd Street from Row to Knoll. It's a project done in connection or conjunction with the city of Prairie Village. And then we will begin continued design and really begin easement and right-of-way acquisition for the Johnson Drive project from Lamar to Metcalf. Then we have a variety of miscellaneous repairs and striping programs, street debt service, On the Parks and Recreation side, we're slowing down a little bit. Penn has had his running shoes on for the last year and a half. But we are looking in 2025 at a Rock Creek Trail resurfacing from Lamar to the west, redo of the locker rooms at the community center, pool liner resurfacing, park maintenance personnel, and then Parks and Recreation debt service. Other funds included, and that what we might highlight, the MCBB fund is the fund that we're required and where we account for transient guest tax revenues that primarily supports the Mission magazine. And we're looking at exploring opportunities to fund some business advertising campaigns in both 24 and 25. The special alcohol fund, as we mentioned, is a third of the alcohol tax. About $65,000 of that goes to UCS's Drug and Alcoholism Council. $90,000 of that is intended to support our mental health co-responder program, which is an incredible resource, not only for those in our community, but for the police department. Solid Waste Utility Fund, and then the TIF and CID funds, where we distribute funds according to the terms of various development agreements. Next slide, key performance areas. So the governing body several years ago established 5 key performance areas intended to be reflective of their top priorities and objectives that have been identified through citizen surveys and other methods. The council worked collectively, but council and staff actually, to develop outcome statements for each of those key performance areas. And then each year we've worked to really tie budget and policy recommendations to those key performance areas. So this first slide illustrates that. And then the next 2 slides share some more detailed information around spending in the 2025 budget in those key performance areas. So in infrastructure, no surprise, is our largest category each year, anticipating to spend a little over $11 million on infrastructure related expenses in 2025. The Parks and Recreation key performance area, we're estimating to spend about $1.77 million. Municipal operations, which is a big broad brush of everything. We don't factor in all of the personnel expenses in the general fund. You'll recall we talked about those being about 9.6 million, or the regular contractual and commodities. This is really just kind of highlighting those additional things or areas of emphasis in municipal operations. And we've got about $882,000 dedicated there. From a sustainability perspective, we're looking at about $425,000. We, again, are continuing. Many of the investments that we've made in sustainability are continuing. We've had a lot of conversation around the work that the departments are doing in researching hybrid or electric vehicle options for conversion of our various fleets. And so in many ways, and then in economic development, about $135,000. And so this is just kind of helpful. I think it's been helpful for me as we try to communicate where our priorities are in the budget and where things align with what we hear you and our residents talking about throughout the year. I'll stop there because I think the next slide just talks about the various ways to sort of stay connected, and you all know how to do that pretty well.
Any questions for Laura? Yeah, Debbie?
2. Number 1, could we go back and kind of reevaluate where we are on recycle bins within the city? At the event on Saturday night, I went by 4 different trash cans and I saw no recycling. And people were asking, I've got a Coke can, where can I put it? And I said, I'll take it home. We need to be real consistent, to me, in the parks. Every time there's a trash can, there needs to be a recycle bin next to it. It's an educational process, but it's really easily done, I think. And if that needs to be a supplemental request,
It does not.
Okay, and secondly, on the page where you've got the different things defined, stormwater, streets, parks, I would add one element for public events, because unless you've got that captured somewhere else, I have that box under parks.
This one? Okay. Yeah, we can certainly add that. I think oftentimes that falls into more of the actual operating costs, but it's a good reminder that there are other things that have capital impacts that
And it takes a lot of staff time to put together.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay, so from here forward, what are our next steps on your agenda? A legislative agenda later this evening, you will have the 3 resolutions of intent, which you will consider. And if you pass those, you will signal that your resolution of intent to exceed the revenue neutral rate for the 2025 budget for the City of Mission, Rock Creek Drainage District number 1 and Rock Creek Drainage District number 2, of which our governing body is the one and the same for the drainage district. We would provide copies of those resolutions, should you pass them, to the county clerk. We're required to do so by July 20th so that sufficient notice can be provided to all the taxpayers in our jurisdiction. And then we would move toward a final public hearing on both the revenue neutral rate and the 2025 revised and 2020 or 2024 revised 2025 recommended budgets in a public hearing at our August 21st City Council meeting. So we still have, there's still things that we will continue to sort of refine and squeeze in as much as we can as we see things continue to improve. But it's a journey every year, and we always appreciate your time and patience in working through that with us. That's all I have.
Justin, did we have any comments or questions online? Anything else from council? Yeah. All right, seeing none, that will end our work session.